As the final rays of sunlight passed through the thick canopy, creating long shadows throughout the forest, there was an uncanny silence. Hunter, a giant scarred mastiff with piercing amber eyes, was on the leaf-strewn ground, stumbled through the brush, his ribs protruding from his once muscular body, which had been malnourished for weeks, strikingly against his matted coat, revealing the brutality of his desperate lone survival. Hunter had keen senses. Every leaf ruffle and slight movement sent off a flicker of hope that he would discover anything to quell the raging hunger in his stomach. But the forest had not been forgiving thus far. He noticed a strange aroma as he walked. It was initially quite subtle, engulfed by the earthy scents of the forest, but they became more potent with each step. It wasn't the aroma of prey, but Hunter stopped, his ears twitching, a new, alien, but obviously alive voice. He sought to identify the source with his nose flaring, and suddenly he heard it faintly. It was a high-pitched cry that was so faint that it could have been mistaken for the whisper of the wind. Hunter moved as the plaintiff, with a vulnerability that pulled at something deep beneath his primal inclinations. He followed the sound with caution, keeping his strong body low to the ground. His amber eyes examined the forest every muscle stiffened in anticipation of peril. The shouts became clearer and louder, and soon he discovered himself awkwardly tucked away among the roots of a huge oak tree at the edge of a tiny clearing. Was the source of the sound an infant with small fists flailing feebly while draped in a ragged mud blanket? Hunter halted, staring at the infant as it cried into the approaching dusk. The sight of the youngster sent his mind was spinning with competing instincts, and hunger was ruthlessly grabbing hold of him, telling him to turn away and let this delicate crevice suffer its fate. But another, deeper, more mysterious instinct. Hunter took a tentative step forward with his enormous paws, anchoring him to the spot. The baby's cries trailed off as if the dog's nose could sense his presence, crunching lightly against the parched leaves. For a few period, he stood still while sniffing the air and turning his head slightly in inquiry. Eyes wide with doubt, Hunter took an action against all odds. Amazingly, he lay next to the infant, wrapping his body over the small figure in a protective manner. The warmth of the Hunter felt something new, almost like purpose, when he felt the baby's weak body against his own. With a quiet, reassuring whine, he temporarily forgot his hunger and the once feral dog that had been shaped by years of battling. And as the night became darker, survival had decided to protect the most defenseless creature he had ever come upon. As the jungle grew colder, a fierce wind blew through the trees, carrying the sounds of faraway predators and hunters with it. Despite his fatigue, he maintained his vigilance and shielded the infant with his body. The child's cries had subsided to gentle whimpers, its tiny chest rising and blotting out the night's chill. Hunter's amber eyes probed the darkness as he fell with frail breaths, his ears tingling at every sound he recognized. The woods was a harsh place where the strong lived and the weak died, but tonight something was different since he was now defending something much more delicate than his own survival. Hunter lowered his head when the infant stirred and made a small sound. The child's aroma, a blend of earth fabric and the child's enormous head, was odd but not disagreeable. Innocence. His nose pushed the blanket tighter around the baby, a reflexive action rather than a conscious one. His hunger, exhaustion, and agony were all overshadowed by a deep, primitive instinct to protect. As the hours went by, the night presented Hunter with fresh difficulties, and a rustle in the surrounding bushes made his ears perk up. He stood in front of the infant, his lips clenched into a silent snarl, prepared to face whatever. A pair of sparkling eyes and a wolf's low, guttural howl came out of the shadows then. A small pack of wolves and another pair of eyes had surrounded the clearing, moving cautiously, but Hunter, a predator, maintained his position, his growls becoming louder, his body acting as a barrier. The wolves circled between the baby and the threat, trying Hunter's resolve, but he remained firm because he knew he was outnumbered and couldn't compete with the pack due to his weak body. But he refused to back down. One wolf swung its jaws, aiming a vicious snarl at Hunter's flank. Hunter twisted, snarled, confronting the assailant directly. His strong jaws clamped down on the wolf's shoulder, compelling it too. Another wolf darted in, this time from the side, but the hunter fled with a yelp. The battle was vicious, and Swift Hunter's huge paw slashed at it, sending it flying into the underbrush. As he protected his delicate charge, his body was a blur of activity, blood stained his fur, and his respiration increased. Ragged and his knees shook from the strain of containing the pack, but at last, after what seemed like an eternity, one by one, the wolves gave in, and their bright eyes vanished into the forest like fireflies. Hunter stood panting in the dark, his head hanging low, his muscles taut, and his body covered with bites and scratches. Trembling but unwavering in his resolution, he turned back to the infant, who was amazingly unhurt despite its small size. Hunter gently pushed the baby, his warm breath grazing its tiny cheek as its face emerged from the covering. Moved, making a quiet noise that seemed almost appreciative, the night continued, but the dogs bond. Hunter realized they couldn't remain outside as the child grew stronger. He needed to find a safe place to stay, could shield the infant without continual dangers hovering over them. With a low whimper, Hunter cautiously held onto the edge. He took the baby's blanket in his teeth and lifted him as gently as he could, moving with purpose with each step. His body was pummeled by the dense forest, but his spirit remained unwavering, and he could smell the faint perfume of water. And he pursued it in the hopes of discovering a spot where they could recuperate. The forest gave way to a tiny creek. Hunter placed the infant on a soft patch of moss, his eyes sweeping the clear water shimmering in the moonlight. After checking his surroundings for danger, he dropped his head into the stream and drank deeply to satisfy his thirst. Edge Hunter went back to the infant and nudged its blanket toward the pool while he lapped at the water with his. The infant twitched feebly, its little hand jerking as the tongue moistened the child's lips in an attempt to revive it. Against all odds, Hunter released a soft, satisfied whine after sensing the chilly dampness. The baby was temporarily relieved by the stream, but the hunter knew they couldn't remain in the jungle for very long. It was no place for the weak, and as he looked over the horizon, his keen eyes noticed a building in disrepair. There wasn't much, but a cabin in the distance was partially obscured by shadows and vines. Hunter snatched up the baby again and headed toward the shelter with newfound vigor, taking slow but. The baby's small weight was insignificant in comparison to the damage sustained during Hunter's arduous journey to the lodge, riddling his body. Yet the weight he bore was not physical. Rather, it was the crushing weight of having to maintain this. Every stride into the thick woodland felt heavier than the last, protecting precious life. Hunter persisted despite the wind rustling the branches overhead and the distant owl's cries resonating through the night. When they eventually arrived at the cottage, the roof drooped, making it a miserable sight. Moonlight was able to filter through the aged walls and shattered windows due to years of neglect. To Hunter, painting the rundown building with eerie silver streaks wasn't a ruin, but it was a haven. He used his nose to pry open the cabin door. The air was dry yet stuffy. The wood creaked loudly in protest, and the ground was covered in a thin coating of dust and debris. But it was sufficient, so Hunter cautiously walked over the. He crossed the door and went to a part of the room that appeared to be protected from the. Gently, he placed the infant on a dry spot of ground and nudged the blanket. The infant's little fingers curled around the edge of the cloth as it shook slightly to make sure the youngster was warm. For a brief while, Hunter's amber eyes softened as he observed carefully. Let himself relax by lowering his body to the floor and encircling the infant in a protective embrace. Breathing slowed the child's chest's regular rise and fall, lulling him to a sound sleep, but Hunter's sleep was. Briefly, he heard a rustling sound outside that wasn't the wind, and his ears perked up. He got up gradually, his body tensed as his keen senses looked for the source of the commotion that the forest had silenced. Unnatural silence fell over the night, and then Hunter's hackles rose, and a deep growl rumbled through the cabin. And he saw movement through the broken glass as his muscles tensed up like a spring about to break. Sparkling eyes that reflected the moonlight wolves once again, and he smelled them. The musky and pungent scent blended with the moist earth that the pack had not abandoned. Followed him, placing his enormous frame between the infant and the impending danger. With their silhouettes darting in and out of the shadows like phantoms, the wolves circled the cabin, approached with its teeth bared and its gaze focused on the bundle of blankets behind Hunter, displaying the primal instinct to defend. Rushed through him, more powerful than his suffering and more powerful than his fatigue. The Hunter counted as the lead wolf's jaws swung forward, snapping inches from his face. His strong jaws clamped down on the wolf's shoulder with a fierce snarl, throwing it away as another wolf lunged in, aiming for his flank from the side, but the hunter twisted and delivered a forceful strike that, despite his wounds, he battled like a beast defending itself, sending it skidding across the floor. Just its own life, but something much more valuable. The conflict was one of chaos and growls. The tiny cabin was filled with dust and debris from yelps and the sound of bodies hitting. Hunter was outnumbered as he spun in the air, lit by the dim moonlight coming through the windows. After what seemed like an age, his resolve remained unwavering despite his strength ebbing with each attack he repulsed. The wolves withdrew into the forest, limping and covered in blood. Hunter stood in the center of the cabin, his body shaking and his breath catching as his bright eyes vanished like dying embers. Blood coated his fur, and every muscle in his body screamed as he came in ragged gasps for relaxation, but his initial concern was for the infant. He turned and hobbled toward the direction of the child, his pulse pounding as he pushed the cover with his nose. The infant was uninjured, and Hunter's steady breathing caused its little chest to rise and fall. Taking a sigh of relief, he lowered himself next to the baby and wrapped his body over him again. Despite his weariness, his protective instinct was still on high alert, and the cabin was quiet once more, but for the soft sound. Hunter closed his eyes and kept his ears steady, listening to the baby's breathing and the odd creak of the ancient wooden timbers. His body was too stiff to completely relax, jerking at every sound, and he knew this was simply a brief respite because the jungle was unforgiving and the cabin's safety wouldn't endure forever. But for the time being they were alive, and that was plenty when dawn dawned, allowing the first rays of sunlight to penetrate the fractured. Hunter's body was awakened by the golden glow emanating from the windows in the tiny room. Aching as he stood up, the infant moved its small fists while it slept. Hunter stared in silence as he reached for the warmth of the morning light, his amber eyes filled with a blend of fatigue and perseverance. He was aware that the woodland was not the end of their journey. The infant required more than just safety to survive. They also required food, drink, and a secure residence where the youngster can flourish and develop. Hunter's body objected to every step he took as he ventured, but his resolve was unwavering. He would find it no matter what. The gentle sunlight coming through the woods when they left the cabin that morning didn't help with the fatigue. He was burdened by the need to locate food and water for both himself and the delicate life he had sworn to save. In spite of his departure, the infant had whimpered gently, its little whimpers disturbing the otherwise peaceful morning. With reluctance, he realized that he couldn't remain in the cabin indefinitely. The woodland appeared more tranquil during the day, yet Hunter's stayed alert, his nose working overtime as every sound of leaves rustling and birds chirping triggered his instincts. The slight smell of moisture guided him farther into the forest as he searched the air for any indication of water or prey. His fur felt the warmth of the rising sun as it left faint impressions on the damp earth, but his mind kept his attention on survival, and at last he noticed a tiny stream slipping through a mossy patch. Hunter's tense nerves were soothed by the sound of flowing water on the covered rocks. Cautiously walked up, his ears turning to listen for any danger, and after making sure the area was clear, he lapped at. His body sagged as the cool water instantly relieved his dry throat. He briefly felt his fatigue subside as he swallowed Hunter's nose, but this relief was fleeting. Noticed a strange smell on the wind. It was subtle but noticeable, with a sharp, metallic note blending with the. As the final rays of sunlight passed through the thick canopy, creating long shadows throughout the forest, there was an uncanny silence. Hunter, a giant scarred mastiff with piercing amber eyes, was on the leaf-strewn ground, stumbled through the brush, his ribs protruding from his once muscular body, which had been malnourished for weeks. Strikingly against his matted coat, revealing the brutality of his desperate lone survival. Hunter had keen senses. Every leaf ruffle and slight movement sent off a flicker of hope that he would discover anything to quell the raging hunger in his stomach. But the forest had not been forgiving thus far. He noticed a strange aroma as he walked. It was initially quite subtle, engulfed by the earthy scents of the forest, but they became more potent with each step. It wasn't the aroma of prey, but Hunter stopped, his ears twitching, a new, alien, but obviously alive voice. He sought to identify the source with his nose flaring, and suddenly he heard it faintly. It was a high-pitched cry that was so faint that it could have been mistaken for the whisper of the wind. Hunter moved as the plaintiff, with a vulnerability that pulled at something deep beneath his primal inclinations. He followed the sound with caution, keeping his strong body low to the ground. His amber eyes examined the forest every muscle stiffened in anticipation of peril. The shouts became clearer and louder, and soon he discovered himself awkwardly tucked away among the roots of a huge oak tree at the edge of a tiny clearing. Was the source of the sound an infant with small fists flailing feebly while draped in a ragged mud blanket? Hunter halted, staring at the infant as it cried into the approaching dusk. The sight of the youngster sent his mind was spinning with competing instincts, and hunger was ruthlessly grabbing hold of him, telling him to turn away and let this delicate crevice suffer its fate. But another, deeper, more mysterious instinct. Hunter took a tentative step forward with his enormous paws, anchoring him to the spot. The baby's cries trailed off as if the dog's nose could sense his presence, crunching lightly against the parched leaves. For a few period, he stood still while sniffing the air and turning his head slightly in inquiry. Eyes wide with doubt, Hunter took an action against all odds. Amazingly, he lay next to the infant, wrapping his body over the small figure in a protective manner. The warmth of the Hunter felt something new, almost like purpose, when he felt the baby's weak body against his own. With a quiet, reassuring whine, he temporarily forgot his hunger and the once feral dog that had been shaped by years of battling. And as the night became darker, survival had decided to protect the most defenseless creature he had ever come upon. As the jungle grew colder, a fierce wind blew through the trees, carrying the sounds of faraway predators and hunters with it. Despite his fatigue, he maintained his vigilance and shielded the infant with his body. The child's cries had subsided to gentle whimpers, its tiny chest rising and blotting out the night's chill. Hunter's amber eyes probed the darkness as he fell with frail breaths, his ears tingling at every sound he recognized. The woods was a harsh place where the strong lived and the weak died, but tonight something was different since he was now defending something much more delicate than his own survival. Hunter lowered his head when the infant stirred and made a small sound. The child's aroma, a blend of earth fabric and the child's enormous head, was odd but not disagreeable. Innocence. His nose pushed the blanket tighter around the baby, a reflexive action rather than a conscious one. His hunger, exhaustion, and agony were all overshadowed by a deep, primitive instinct to protect. As the hours went by, the night presented Hunter with fresh difficulties, and a rustle in the surrounding bushes made his ears perk up. He stood in front of the infant, his lips clenched into a silent snarl, prepared to face whatever. A pair of sparkling eyes and a wolf's low, guttural howl came out of the shadows then. A small pack of wolves and another pair of eyes had surrounded the clearing, moving cautiously, but Hunter, a predator, maintained his position, his growls becoming louder, his body acting as a barrier. The wolves circled between the baby and the threat, trying Hunter's resolve, but he remained firm because he knew he was outnumbered and couldn't compete with the pack due to his weak body. But he refused to back down. One wolf swung its jaws, aiming a vicious snarl at Hunter's flank. Hunter twisted, snarled, confronting the assailant directly. His strong jaws clamped down on the wolf's shoulder, compelling it to. Another wolf darted in, this time from the side, but the hunter fled with a yelp. The battle was vicious, and swift Hunter's huge paw slashed at it, sending it flying into the underbrush. As he protected his delicate charge, his body was a blur of activity, blood stained his fur, and his respiration increased. ragged, and his knees shook from the strain of containing the pack. But at last, after what seemed like an eternity, one by one, the wolves gave in, and their bright eyes vanished into the forest like fireflies. Hunter stood panting in the dark, his head hanging low, his muscles taut, and his body covered with bites and scratches. Trembling but unwavering in his resolution, he turned back to the infant, who was amazingly unhurt despite its small size. Hunter gently pushed the baby, his warm breath grazing its tiny cheek as its face emerged from the covering. Moved, making a quiet noise that seemed almost appreciative, the night continued, but the dogs bond. Hunter realized they couldn't remain outside as the child grew stronger. He needed to find a safe place to stay, could shield the infant without continual dangers hovering over them. With a low whimper, Hunter cautiously held onto the edge. He took the baby's blanket in his teeth and lifted him as gently as he could, moving with purpose with each step. His body was pummeled by the dense forest, but his spirit remained unwavering, and he could smell the faint perfume of water. And he pursued it in the hopes of discovering a spot where they could recuperate. The forest gave way to a tiny creek. Hunter placed the infant on a soft patch of moss, his eyes sweeping the clear water shimmering in the moonlight. After checking his surroundings for danger, he dropped his head into the stream and drank. The wolves started to back away, and their leader, who was limping and bruised, gave a guttural snarl before vanishing into the shadows, one by one, with the others following their bright eyes as they faded into the darkness. Hunter's body cried out for rest as he stood in the clearing, his fur and chest heaving blood. He stayed alert, listening for any noise that may indicate their return, and the woodland became quiet again. Hunter walked slowly and laboriously back to the cabin, the only sound being the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Gently pushed the door wide, and his eyes went straight to the infant, who was still asleep and curled up in a tiny. Hunter's body relaxed a little inside the blanket's folds, relief sweeping over him like a wave as he lowered himself. His body was curled protectively around the infant on the ground next to it, and every movement caused jolts of pain through him, but he disregarded it because his work wasn't done yet. He laid his head on his shoulder, eyes on the entrance, ears perceptive for any indication. He couldn't afford to let his guard down in the face of peril, and the infant didn't even stir in its sleep for a little second. Hunter softly pushed it with his nose as the child let out a whimper, and his warm breath helped to soothe it back into a tranquil state. Even though his body ached and his wounds throbbed, Hunter refused to close his eyes as the night dragged on. The infant was safe for the time being, but he was aware that the wolves would return at dawn, started to break, illuminating the jungle with gentle light. Hunter at last gave himself permission to unwind a little because the battle had left him exhausted and bruised. Yet the sunlight shining through was all that mattered since he had safeguarded the baby. A brief feeling of peace was brought about by the fissures in the cabin's walls, which served as a reminder that they had made it through another night. But the hunter was aware that this was just the beginning and that there were other threats in the forest besides wolves and the infants. He needed a strategy to guarantee their safety beyond the vulnerable, because cries may easily draw in more predators. Walls of the hut. His amber eyes glowed with resolve as he looked at the child who was sleeping, regardless of what could be there. He would defend it in the future, and they would both live. The woodland was illuminated by a gentle golden glow in the morning. But the hunter awakened, his beaten body throbbing from the battle, but tranquility was a lie. Every movement caused acute jolts of anguish through his muscles, and his fur was matted with dried blood. He got up out of tiredness, his amber eyes searching the cabin for any indications of a disturbance. The infant was still there. Hunter approached the door while its tiny chest, tucked away in its blanket, rose and fell with each calm breath. He moved slowly but purposefully, sticking his nose outside to sniff the crisp morning air for any signs of the wolves. His instincts told him that even if the predators were no longer there, the faint metallic tang of blood persisted. Couldn't remain here. Although the cabin provided some shelter, it was exposed and at risk if the wolves came back with larger numbers, or if further threats materialized. Hunter would be unable to repel them once more, so he turned back to the baby, gently prodding it with his nose, causing its small hands to reach out and stir. Hunter, reaching instinctively for warmth, made a gentle, reassuring sound to huff and. He had to acquire food and water for the infant as well as for himself before running to the door. His protective instincts were wearing thin, and he could only go so far outside the hut until the forest appeared to. The trees were alive with birds calling to one another, and the undergrowth rustled with the sounds of tiny creatures, but the hunter ignored them because his main concern was surviving. He went a short way from the cabin to acquire the necessities that would keep them both alive and his ears. The forest floor was covered in broken branches and fallen leaves, and people were often looking for signals of danger. Hunter's keen nose detected the scent of water, and each step served as a reminder of how precarious their circumstances were. He cautiously followed it through the thick foliage till he came onto a small brook. It was weak but distinct. Hunter cautiously approached the clear water, his ears perking up at every sound as he drank it. Once he was content, the chilly beverage helped to relieve his dry throat and restore some of his vitality. Looked back toward the cabin. The infant would also require water, but he couldn't bring it back. Something was sparked when he noticed a used plastic bottle entangled in the roots of a neighboring tree. Hunter had a dim recall of people and their peculiar implements. Cautiously picked up the bottle with his cushioned jaws. The plastic crinkled beneath his teeth, but it held. Together, he filled it at the stream while cocking his head to prevent spills, and then he started the cautious journey back to. When he got back to the cabin, the infant was awake, its gentle screams filling the little space. Hunter quickly moved to its side, putting down the drink and using his nose to prod the child's small fists against the blanket. Hunter whimpered softly, uncertain of how to stop its face from flailing and scrunching in distress. He gently and instinctively licked its cheek to calm it, and the baby's screaming subsided to a few tiny whimpers. Hunter gently tipped the bottle, causing a few drops of water to land on the child's lips. The infant replied. As he saw his protective instincts, a hunter felt a wave of relief as his mouth moved automatically to drink. Again, but this was only a short-term fix. They required more than just water. The sound of rustling leaves outside the cabin jolted Hunter to attention because they needed food, shelter, and a strategy. As he approached the door, his body tightened and his ears perked up. He smelt the air. Hunter's heart was racing at the familiar scent of the wolves they hadn't abandoned. His body blocked the entryway as he snarled deep in his throat, looking around the forest for any movement. The wolves were. Hunter was shrewd enough to hide amid the woods this time, but he could sense their presence and the tracking of their attentive eyes. He realized he couldn't allow them to test his resolve with every move they were waiting for. Linger because he would be severely disadvantaged if they struck again. He resorted to. The infant softly nudged it, and the child's eyes widened as though they could sense the strain. Hunter was aware that he needed to move swiftly since they had to locate a new home and living in the cabin was no longer an option. Safer location where the wolves couldn't follow, but given his condition, the trip would be risky. Hunter slowly walked outside after carefully picking up the infant in its blanket and holding it between his jaws. A deep growl rumbled in his throat as he took the first tentative step, his gaze darting to the shadows where the wolves hid. The wolves remained still as the hunter moved away from the lodge, but he could feel them pressed up against him like a bodily weight as the woodland encircled them, and Hunter proceeded at a steady, moderate pace to maintain the warmth of the infant. Every stride felt like a struggle against his chest, which gave him strength and served as a reminder of why he couldn't give up. With every movement, his damaged leg protested, but he pressed on his ears and kept turning to listen for sounds of. Hunter's thoughts were racing as the wolves pursued them from a distance, their silent presence a continual danger. He had to locate higher ground, a defendable stance from which he might shield the infant in the event that the wolves struck once again, and his amber eyes searched the forest for anything that could give him an advantage. At last, he noticed a small but noticeable rocky outcrop rising above the thick underbrush. If he could get to it, he could keep the wolves at bay. Hunter adjusted because it was high and surrounded by steep inclines. His hold on the infant and started climbing, scraping the hard stone with his claws as he hauled himself higher. Wolves reacted quickly. Their snarls reverberated throughout the woodland as their slender forms broke free from the shadows. The hunter roared as he darted toward the outcrop, his pace quickening despite the anguish coursing through his limbs. Hunter turned abruptly as he reached the top, just as the first wolf thrust its jaws, snapping millimeters from his tail. Wall of strength and resolve as he confronted the pack. The infant was currently secure behind him, but the battle was far from over. He then gave a ferocious bark, which echoed through the jungle like a. Hunter was aware of the wolves' hesitancy and unsure motions as they evaluated the task at hand. Was his time to take action since his protective instincts kicked in, and he couldn't afford to let the wolves win. Hunter braced his massive body, overcoming his fatigue as he got ready to defend the infant again, keeping the infant out of sight as the wolves moved forward, their eyes shining with a predatory desire. The lead wolf, who was bigger than the others, spreads out in a semicircle, obstructing any escape routes. Its fur, which was streaked with silver, gave a deep growl that sent. Despite his wounds, Hunter didn't flinch when shivers ran through the trees. His protective instinct came into play, enhancing his awareness and fortifying his will. He released his lips pulled back to display sharp fangs and a guttural snarl that wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the little life that was dependent on him initially. When the wolf's teeth swung toward Hunter's throat, he twisted his body to block the blow with a strong. The wolf staggered after being shoved in the shoulder, but he immediately got up and circled around to join the others. A second wolf then darted in. He reacted quickly as his jaws were aimed for Hunter's flank from the side. The yelp of agony reverberated throughout the forest as the pack closed in on the wolf's scruff and tossed it aside, but the pack wasn't. Dissuaded the lead wolf to advance, and it briefly locked eyes with the hunters during a quiet conversation. A struggle of wills, and suddenly, perhaps responding to an unsaid cue, the pack launched an attack in. Hunter met them head-on in tandem, his strong body moving with the grace and accuracy that come from years of survival. The jungle appeared to hold its breath as growls and teeth clashed filled the air. Hunter spun violently and threw it off before the wolf could clamp its jaws into his hind leg. Could cause significant harm. Another wolf lunged for his throat, but the hunter dodged and retaliated, burying his teeth into the. Despite his fierce defense, the number started to weigh on Hunter's shoulder, and his movements slowed. His legs shook under the strain, and his fur was matted with more bloody breaths. But each time the wolves arrived, being around the infant gave him a boost of strength and motivation to continue battling the. Unaware of the danger, the infant cried softly from behind him. The wolves' attack appeared to be momentarily stopped by sound, and Hunter took advantage of the momentary break to move the infant to a narrow rock fissure where the wolves would have a tougher time getting at it. The lead wolf gave an order as he turned back to the pack, his snarl intensifying as he got ready for another round. And the pack moved forward once more, this time with greater caution, having misjudged Hunter's resolve. However, they persisted, and the lead wolf's jaws swung perilously close to Hunter's face, which he avoided. The wolf's action was slower but still accurate, and he countered with a strong paw swipe before yelping blood that stained its silver fur. But it refused to let up, and the battle continued, with every second being a test of. Hunter knew he couldn't do this indefinitely since his vision became blurry. His breath came in frantic gasps and his muscles screamed in anguish. But he persisted in growling and biting. Every stride was an affirmation that the infant would live, no matter what, until all of a sudden a new sound broke through the. Hunter's ears perked up when he heard the slight crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. The wolves hesitated, their ears darting toward the sound while his body tensed as he tried to pinpoint its origin. Increased in volume, and Hunter smelled something that made his heart race. A human aroma emerging from the thick. A man with a worn face and a gun slung over his shoulder appeared out of the underbrush. His gaze expanded at seeing the image of a scarred-blooded canine, standing resolutely amid a group of. The man lifted his weapon and aimed it skyward, firing a loud shot at wolves and what looked to be a baby concealed in the rocks. The wolves froze, their ears flattening in response to the sound that echoed through the forest like a thunderclap. A second shot came, and the pack started to back off, their snarls diminishing as Hunter held his ground, his chest heaving as he watched the wolves fade back into the tree shadows. Vanish. The man came cautiously, his rifle down, but his stance wary. Hunter's body remained tense as he snarled low in his voice, but he didn't. After everything he had been through, he knew he couldn't trust anyone, but he also knew he couldn't keep the kid safe by himself for very long. A few feet distant, the man paused, his eyes softening as he took in the situation. "Easy, boy," he whispered in a steady, quiet voice. Hunter's snarl subsided a little, but he maintained his defensive posture. The man knelt, setting his weapon aside. He held out his hand and said, "You've been through a lot, haven't you? But you performed well and maintained that." Hunter, the small one secure, sniffed the air, his nose twitching as he detected the man's scent, which was free of hostility. Only worry. Hunter warily and slowly moved aside, letting the man approach the nook where the infant was lying. The man gently reached in and scooped the youngster into his. As it nestled against him, the baby's sobbing ceased and its arms stirred. The man remarked, looking at Hunter, "You saved this baby's life. You're a hero. You know that." Hunter's legs buckled as he lowered his head, finally succumbing to tiredness, and he fell to the ground, his body quivering with exhaustion. The man approached him and put a comforting hand on his. Softly he whispered, "Hey, come on, boy. Let's get you both somewhere safe." Hunter pushed himself to his feet while carrying the infant toward the forest's edge. His body swayed, but his determination, unflinching yet determined. He followed them for the first time. There were moments when he had hope, a feeling that perhaps they were. When he was at last safe, the man led the way through the thick woodland, holding the baby as he looked back to be sure Hunter was keeping up with the dog's strained and sluggish steps, each one demonstrating. Although his breathing was short and his fur was strewn with blood due to sheer resolve, his gaze never left the guy and the infant. "Hang in there, boy." The guy, protecting the youngster, had become his one goal, and he wasn't prepared to give it up. He spoke in a steady, quiet voice, and as we got closer, the trees started to thin out, revealing smoke curled from the dim shape of a home tucked away in a tiny clearing. Chimney as the aroma of burning wood blended with the refreshing forest air, causing a moment of relief too. Hunter's body was still stiff, but he had been on watch for too long and had fought for too long to allow his. With his defenses down, the man used his shoulder to smash open the cabin door, entered, and sat. The infant was resting on a clean, old blanket on a couch. The room was plain yet cozy, with the gentle glow of a. Hunter paused at the threshold as the fire created flickering shadows on the walls. The man motioned with his hand, his posture tense as his eyes searched the area for possible dangers. Hunter's paw slipped on the wooden stairs, his body pleading for rest, but his instincts told him to be careful. "You're safe here." At last, as though he could sense the earnestness in the man's voice, he entered the fire's warmth enveloped him, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, his muscles relaxed. A man knelt before him, his eyes full of wonder and worry. "You're a mess, buddy," he whispered quietly. Hunter recoiled as the man reached for a first aid kit on a neighboring shelf, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Stopped and raised his hands in a peace sign, saying, "It's cool, I'm just going to." Assistant Hunter observed him fatiguedly, his body taut with strain, but when the man moved, Hunter permitted the cautious opening of the package and the removal of a clean cloth. The dog flinched as the man approached and applied a soft yet strong touch to the wounds on Hunter's shoulder. Didn't move, his gaze fixed on the infant curled up on the couch. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, man?" Whispered, more to himself than to Hunter, "but you persisted." Hunter's small ears perked up at the man's remarks, the soft, strangely reassuring tone unusual. As fatigue weighted him down, he lowered his head and closed his eyes for a moment. The baby stirred and let out a gentle. Hunter's head flew up, his body tensing as his attention snapped to the youngster, and a whimper pierced the silence. Gently laughed, "Calm down, boy, I got it." He went to the couch and lifted the infant into. The sight of the small, delicate life in his care caused something deep inside Hunter to stir. His protective instinct was so powerful that it overcame his fatigue, and he stood up, his legs shaking as he moved forward the man and the infant, You're not lowering your defenses, are you? The man asked with a little smile. I can't blame you, but I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. The dad delicately put the baby down at his lips. Before turning back to Hunter, he wrapped it in a larger blanket and said, "Let me see if I can find you something to eat." Hunter's ears perked up at the word eat as they approached a tiny kitchen area, but he kept his gaze fixed on the infant, as though he was scared it would vanish if he turned away, while the man dug through. Eventually, a cabinet produced a bowl and a can of dog food. He placed the bowl on the ground and opened the can. "Here you go," he murmured, setting the food down as the aroma of it filled the room. Hunter hesitated, his instincts still cautious despite the raging desire in his stomach. "But within reach, you've earned this." At last, he moved nearer and lowered his head to smell the meal. It wasn't much, but it was sufficient to ease the pain in his stomach. So he ate his. As the hours went by, the tension in the room increased as his eyes darted between the guy and the infant, and his ears flicked at every sound. Cabin started to relax, and the man walked cautiously while observing Hunter's personal space. Hunter, remaining vigilant, permitted himself to lie down close to the fire to keep it going and keep the infant warm. Couch, his eyes protectively coiled about the infant's makeshift bed. The man sat down in a chair, his ears never completely shut, twitching at every creak and creak of the ancient wooden structure. As he observed the unusual duo, his eyes were weighted with thinking. "You're not just any dog, are you?" he murmured softly. Hunter didn't react, but his voice broke the silence. "You have more strength than most individuals I've met." Staying on the infant, but the man's remarks echoed in the humid air, a silent recognition of the connection that had created between them outside while the trees carried the sound of the wind. Despite the prospect of another chilly night, there was warmth and security within the cabin. Hunter's body relaxed, his breathing steadied as the fire crackled, and the shaky foundations of trust. For the first time in days, there was a brief but gentle calm in the hearth. Hunter released a sound when the baby's small fingers twitched in slumber, marking a priceless moment of peace among the craziness of their voyage. He let out a deep, satisfied sigh. His heart swelled with a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Hopefully, the morning light came through the gaps in the wooden walls of the hut, creating faint yellow streaks across the. Hunter's eyes opened, and his ears flicked in response to the slight rustling sound outside, where the fire's warmth had diminished to flickering embers, and the only sound in the room was the baby's gentle breathing while curled up on the couch. The man moaned softly as he shifted in his chair, looking at the hunters and giving a little tired. "Good morning, friend. It looks like we survived the night." Since Hunter remained motionless. From his position, still curled up protectively close to the infant, the baby's and man's aroma, as well as the subtle hints of. For the first time in days, the air was filled with smoke from the dying fire, and Hunter's senses weren't overpowered by danger or fear, but his body tightened as he inhaled the slight breeze that was entering through the wall gaps. Something was out there, though. The man saw Hunter's unusual attention, his eyes fixed on the cabin door, and his ears rising up straight. "Is it?" he questioned softly as he got up from his chair and walked to the window to look out. He initially noticed only the trees gently swaying as he entered the clearing. He noticed movement in the distance as the wind's branches formed long shadows on the icy ground. Hunter muttered. The man's heart quickened as the shape darted between the trees, quick and low to the ground. His thoughts were verified by the dog's low snarl when the shape appeared from the tree line, then a second, and finally a third wolf, whose sleek bodies moved. Hunter rose, stood up, his muscles taut, and their noses directed toward the cabin with uncanny synchronicity. The man moved away from the window, his thoughts racing, and he took a position between the door and the infant. He looked at Hunter and gripped a chunk of firewood from the pile close to him, saying, "Looks like we've got company." Whispered, "Remain close," in a calm yet forceful tone. The wolves then circled the area there. They moved with the precision of carnivores, their hunger visible in the way their tongues moved, their keen gaze searching the cabin. One of them gave a low, guttural growl as they flicked across their fangs, and the others did the same, their snarls echoing. As he stepped closer through the silent morning air, Hunter bared his teeth and roared back. The man put a hand on. The infant whined. "Easy, boy. Let's not rush into this." His shoulder was preventing him. Hunter looked back, gently reducing the tension in the room for a minute. His protective instincts kicking in, he gave a piercing bark that sounded like a warning, to reverberate throughout the cabin and beyond, causing the wolves to freeze and twitch their ears. The man inhaled deeply. His thoughts was racing, and he couldn't allow the wolves to approach too closely since Hunter and the infant were both in danger. Kneeling by the fire, he grabbed a partially burned wood and blew on the embers until the sudden blast of light caused them to flame. The smoke made the wolves pause, their steps slowing as they closely observed the cabin. "I haven't," the man whispered, looking at Hunter. "If this doesn't work, you're going to have to hold them off." Hunter didn't look away from the door. The man snarled deeply and firmly before grabbing a tin can from the kitchen shelf and added a few nails and screws, making a loud, startling clattering noise. Put it in the fire, the metal heating quickly as sparks started to crackle and explode outside the wolves inching. The lead wolf was a big, silver-furred beast with piercing yellow eyes, and they were driven toward the cabin by their hunger. Enter the clearing, assuming a dominant and fearless stance. It then gave a harsh bark, and the others started to fan out. Their gazes met the tiny wooden building, and Hunter sprang forward, growling fiercely as his body slammed against the door, seemingly daring them to try. But the wolves paused, obviously spooked by his presence. But the lead wolf continued to advance its muscles without faltering, with its contents rattling. The man caught the now red-hot tin can with a thick towel as it was ready to attack. He threw it menacingly out the door, and the can spun through the air before exploding with a loud clang. Hit, throwing a column of flames and ash above and sending the heated nails flying in all directions. The Wool W yelled there. The lead wolf growled, its eyes narrowing as they broke formation in an attempt to dodge the surprise attack. Hot, but even it appeared hesitant to move forward, as the smell of flames and burning metal repelled its innate need to hunt. Hunter snarled once more, pressing his body up against the door and using his weight to force it shut. The man swiftly secured. As they listened for any indications of escape outside the lock, the two of them were panting profusely. The wolves lingered at the edge of the clearing, their eyes shining in the darkness, but they started to growl and retreat one by one. The lead wolf was the final to keep its eyes on the cabin as it faded into the distance before turning, and the man sagged against the wall, his hold on the firewood slipping as he vanished into the trees. Then, dabbing perspiration from his forehead, he glanced down at Hunter, whose body remained rigid and prepared. "Are you okay, boy?" he asked. Hunter stared at the door, breathing heavily but steadily, and then he turned and started to move, returning to the couch, his eyes softening as he checked on the infant, who had ceased whimpering and was now. The man crouched next to them, his palm resting on Hunter's chest, and his steady, gentle breathing appeared to soothe Hunter's anxiety. "Hey, you did well," he said quietly, "and we both did." The cabin went quiet again. Although there was a slight smoke odor in the air, they were safe for the time being, but both man and dog were aware of the risks outside, hadn't entirely vanished together, so they needed to be prepared for whatever occurred next. The cabin fell into a tense. Hunter lay by the infant as the morning light became stronger and spilled through the broken windows in golden stripes. His body was still tense from the excitement of the battle with the creek, and his ears were twitching at every rustle. The man sat in the corner with his head in his hands while the wolves gradually faded away. Although they were unharmed at the time of the events, the weight of what had transpired occurred and hung heavy in the air, causing the baby to stir and release its small hand. Hunter quickly pushed the blanket closer with his nose tucked in while clutching at the empty air hunter. The man silently marveled at the dog's instincts as he softly surrounded the infant. Protector revealing himself once more. "You're amazing." "You know that," the man remarked quietly, his voice shattering the. Hunter's ears twitched in silence, but he kept his full attention on the infant outside the woodland, which seemed eerily, even though the wolves had left. The guy was aware that predators frequently waited in silence for a. In his moment of vulnerability, he got up and started to go about the cabin, looking for any weaknesses. The door was. Walls weren't much better, And if the wolves came back, it would be. He whispered to himself more than to Hunter. It's hard to keep them out. We can't stay here forever. We need to find a safer. Finally looked up, his amber eyes meeting at a location with actual shelter. The man stood with a gentle huff, as though he understood and sensed the vulnerability of their circumstances. The father paced the little cabin, his figure towering protectively over the infant. Making a plan, he reasoned that there must be a way to bring the infant to safety. The trip to the closest town, which was miles distant through a thick forest, would be perilous, but remaining here was not in. He looked at the strewn about remains of the cabin's former occupants and muttered, "Option, I'll need supplies." There were only a few empty jars, a moth-eaten blanket, and some old tools. However, he took the tools and tested their weight, one of them being a Hunter patted over his nose with a large wrench that might be used as a weapon if necessary. The contact was comforting and grounded as it brushed over the man's hand. "Yeah, I know," the man responded, smiling slightly. As they were about to depart, the infant let out a quiet scream, and Hunter instantly turned his head. "We'll work it out together." The man knelt next to them, carefully taking up the baby while tilting his head to examine the child's requirements. "It's okay," whispered and gently rocked it. The baby's little whimpers continued, but the crying stopped. Pulled at his heart, saying, "We need to go quickly." He looked to Hunter and stated, "I don't think." Hunter barked quietly in agreement, shaking his tail once, demonstrating that this little one can withstand another chilly night outside. He turned to face the door, adjusting the improvised sling he had made out of the frayed blanket. He opened the door while holding the wrench in one hand and supporting the infant on his chest. The woodland was illuminated by gentle morning light, and the air outside was clear and peaceful. Hunter followed the man's eyes as they scanned the tree line, first putting his nose to the ground and his ears alert. The trail ahead was rough, with fallen branches and areas of wet mud, making it impossible to spot any activity. Every step was a hardship, but they persisted since they had to find safety as they went. The man started to notice small changes as he went deeper into the forest. The trees got taller, and their branches started to entwine. The air was colder and the light was dimmer here, creating a natural canopy. Felt ominous and protective, as though the forest itself were observing their every action. Hunter's pace accelerated his. He paused occasionally to sniff the air and the ground before continuing, following his instincts that led them onward. After an hour of strolling, they came across him, fully trusting him, knowing that the dog's senses were considerably more acute than his own. Clear water trickled over polished stones in a little creek. The man, kneeling next to it, he gently placed the infant on a patch of dry moss while using his hands to scoop up water, and Hunter brought the cool liquid to his lips. It was a brief relief from the fatigue that was pressing him down. Drank as well, gulping the water with his tongue. When he was finished, the man grinned as he turned to face the infant, softly nudging its blanket. "We're fortunate to have you," he added, scratching behind Hunter's back. His heart swelled with appreciation for the dog's constant care. The dog's eyes quickly closed in satisfaction as he leaned into the contact of his ears, but the little period of calm was interrupted by Rush Ling and the surrounding bushes, which had both humans and dogs on high alert. Hunter's ears pricked up, and he growled softly, tensing up the man, tightened his hold on the wrench, and examined the surroundings, whispering, "Stay close," putting himself between. Hunter moved forward as the noise and the infant's rustling got louder. The man's heart pounded, his muscles tensed, and his teeth flashed in silent warning. Prepared, a figure sprang out of the brush. It wasn't a predator, but the woman was breathless and unkempt, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and horror. When she saw them, she paused, her eyes jumping from the man to the dog, and then to the infant. "Please," she pleaded. "When I saw the smoke coming from your cabin, I thought perhaps someone could help me, but I'm not here to hurt you." Hunter's snarl grew softer, but his stance still defensive. The man lowered the wrench a little, his eyes narrowing. Examined her. She appeared worn out, and her clothing were ripped and filthy, but there was a genuine desperation in her face that reflected his own. "What do you need?" he inquired warily. "Something's out there. I've been running all night, please," the woman said, looking back over her shoulder with quivering body. Hunter moved closer to the man, his nose grazing his knee, and the man groaned. "I just need a safe place to rest." "All fine," he murmured, looking down at the infant. "But if you do anything, I—" Will she not interrupt, raising her hands in a peace sign? "You pledge the—" Hunter remained close, his eyes never leaving the route as the man nodded, gesturing for her to follow. "Stranger," the man's mind was racing with doubt, and he didn't have all faith in her, but for the time being, they were forced to proceed as a group. Hunter approached the man as there was a tense silence in the jungle. His strong body protected the infant, and his keen eyes occasionally darted to the mother, who lingered for a few walks carefully behind her as if she didn't want to startle the dog. The man began by asking, "What's her name?" "Leah," and she replied softly. "I was hiking with a group when we split up," and she glanced at him before lowering her gaze to her feet. Her words drifted off. Hunter's ears perked up as her gaze darted tensely toward the surrounding dark forests, as if someone were pursuing me. As she spoke, he looked around the woodland as if to validate what she had said. What kind of thing did the man press? I didn't see it clearly, but his tone was strong, and LLA acknowledged, shaking her head. Her voice continued despite the fast-paced sounds, and only eyes in the dark shuddered and folded her arms as if attempting to block off the recollection. The man looked at Hunter, who, as though in agreement, he placed the infant in its sling and flexed his protective instincts, giving a gentle owl. He continued in a stern voice, "We'll deal with it if it comes back. But for now, we're just moving forward." LLA nodded, accelerating her pace. As the morning wore on, the woodland appeared to close in on them, so they matched their pace. The road was blocked from much of the sunshine as the trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, and their canopy denser. Rocky, with jagged rocks and twisted roots, making them tread carefully at every sound, including the cracking of branches. Hunter abruptly felt the anxiety increase as the distant chirp of birds was amplified. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his throat as he prevented his body from hardening. The man halted, his hand tightening around a wrench as he gazed into the darkness ahead. "What is it?" he muttered to Lila. Her eyes grew wide, and she gripped a tree trunk for balance. "Is it them?" she inquired. The woodland appeared to pause its breath as she spoke, and then there was a low, eerie howl, followed by another. Hunter's snarl became deeper as the sound reverberated, getting closer with each repeat. The man's heart thumped, and his fur stood on end. "Stay close to me," he said. Hunter took a fierce and uncompromising attitude, putting himself between her and the impending menace. A pair of bright yellow eyes emerged from the shadows, followed by more and more wolves in sleek shapes. They moved with predatory grace, their eyes fixed on the tree as their muscles rippled beneath their heavy coats. The man lifted the wrench, clenching his jaw, and mumbled, "We don't want trouble," knowing that his words were meaningless. He looked down at the infant and then at Hunter, protecting the animals. Without hesitation, he moved forward and positioned himself between the other people and the wolves. His growl was low. Bede warned the lead wolf, who was bigger than the rest, with his scary teeth. In response, it growled and raised its hackles, causing the man to crouch on his free arm. Speaking in a tense voice, he informed Shieldla that if they rush us, we'll hold them off. Ole shook her head angrily. "I'm not abandoning you." The wolves moved cautiously forward. The dog responded immediately when the lead wolf rushed first, clamping its teeth just inches from Hunter's face. The two beasts battled, snarling and snapping their jaws as he struck the wolf with a hard blow. The other wolves paused for a while before circling their keen eyes to analyze the growls that filled the woodland. Lila and the man both sprang forward, trying to reach the infant, but the man used all of his might to swing the wrench against the metal. The wolf yelled back into the shadows as the hunter's strong teeth made contact with a horrible crack. With the other wolves flanking him, the two animals locked onto the lead wolf's shoulder and tumbled in a whirl of fur and jaws. Hunter moved with precision despite his fatigue, his blows well-planned and devastating. The man swung the wrench. He yelled, throwing the baby, just missing another wolf LLA taking it. Sling in her direction, she gasped, her face going white with terror. "Grab it and leave." "I'll hold them off." LLA hesitated, but she grabbed the sling because there was no place for debate given the intensity in his words. "I'll wait for you," she wailed, holding the infant tightly against her bosom. Hunter, who was now fighting two wolves at once, let out a ferocious bark as she staggered backward with tears flowing down her cheeks. Unwavering in his resolve, the man moved closer and stood next to the dog, saying, "You're not doing this," he whispered, "alone, buddy," and they retaliated together, their motions synced. The wolves hissed and snapped their numbers, giving them an advantage, as if they had been mates for years. Savage, but Hunter and the guy resisted, forcing the pack to back off with their growls and turning to, whimpering as they retreated into the trees. The woodland was once more quiet but for the ragged sounds of human breathing and the man squatted next to Hunter as his body trembled with fatigue and new scrapes marred his coat. His hand, "You did it, boy," he whispered quietly, leaning on the dog's heaving side. Hunter, overcome with emotion, kissed his palm when a sign of appreciation and friendship emerged from the "Are you okay, Shadows?" she asked, holding the infant in her arms. The man murmured, shaking, "We're fine," his body aching with each step. "Thank you." Hunter gave him a little prod, his gaze sweeping the woodland one final time before he relaxed, the wolves no longer present. Now, but the threat was still present. "So we must relocate," the man murmured, forcing himself to stand up. "This location isn't no longer safe." Lala nodded and tightened her hold on the infant, and they started to. Hunter was limping a little, but he was determined to stay at the man's side because their link had grown stronger. Night had fallen entirely, shrouding the forest in darkness, and they would face whatever was ahead together. Hunter went through an impenetrable darkness that was only interrupted by the faint glow of stars peeking through the foliage. Carefully, his breathing became difficult, but resolutely, the infant snuggled into the blanket to keep warm. Clara slept soundly, and the ranger trailed closely behind them, their headlights emitting faint beams that showed the crooked route ahead, making each step feel more difficult as the weariness increased. Hunter slowed his pace as the icy cold grew more intense, occasionally turning to make sure Clara saw how the dog's head maintained its high muscles while the group remained together. "He's tracking something," she muttered to the ranger, coiled like twisted wires. Hunter halted as a deep growl rumbled in his throat, possibly indicating that he had discovered another trail. Clara and the ranger stopped in their tracks as they scanned the dark forest, his ears standing at full attention on his chest. The ranger, clutching his flashlight and looking for movement among them, remarked, "Something's out there around them." The sound of a snapping branch shattered the silence in the shadows. Hunter hunkered head low, his growl intensifying as a warning, and then there was rustling in the bushes. Clara grasped. She whispered, "Could it be another animal?" as the infant got closer and her heart began to race. To soothe herself, but their concerns materialized when a dark form emerged from the bushes. It was a man's. With his hands in the pockets of a beat-up jacket and his face hidden by a frayed hood, his eyes were icy and "Lost in the woods, are we?" He's calculating, his features curving into a frightening grin. The ranger moved forward as he spoke, sending shivers down their spines. Lifting his torch to better see the stranger's face, he asked, "Who are you and what do you want?" The man took a step closer, ignoring the query, his voice calm but cautious. "Finding a well-trained dog and an abandoned infant seems like something you don't see every day." Hunter's snarl intensified as he positioned himself squarely in front of Clara and the infant his body was holding, "Which might be of interest to me." The ranger swiftly evaluated the situation and was ready to pretend that we were unaware of your identity. He said firmly, looking for trouble. The stranger laughed in a tone devoid of amusement. He responded, nodding behind him, "You don't get to decide whether there's trouble." Two more figures appeared from the. Clara held her breath while holding the infant in the dark, both of them with knives and wearing equally scary expressions. The ranger moved closer to Hunter in a protective manner, anticipating whatever was going to happen. "We're not searching for A." He spoke calmly when he ordered, "Fight," yet there was a lot of tension in the air. Hunter made a fast, explosive leap before waiting for them to initiate contact, even though it seemed inevitable. Hunter's unexpected attack was a whirl of movement, as he pounced for the closest man. The first man was knocked off balance and sent flying to the ground by a huge body that crashed with him. The man let Hunter's jaws clamp down on his forearm, causing him to drop his knife, while the other two guys let out a scared cry. Reacted swiftly. One swung his knife up in Hunter's direction, and the other moved toward Clara and the infant. The second man stumbled backward into a wall after the ranger went forward and grabbed him with a hard shove. The ranger yelled, "Tree, stay back," his voice resonating throughout the woods. Hunter. Meanwhile, he moved out of the way of the third man's knife slash, which just missed him. Hunter slashed into the air just above his head, his roar deep and guttural. Despite his fatigue, his ferocity seemed to catch as he flung himself once more, his fangs being and his power remaining unyielding. The attackers were caught off guard, and their early assurance gave way to trepidation. Clara held the infant closely at her back. She sought to protect the child from the commotion. She could hear the noises of her heart pounding as she moved toward the closest tree. Of the fight, the piercing growls, the laborious groans, and the monotonous thump of. She looked at the ranger who was struggling with one of the men, using all of her strength as her body struck the ground. Ability to sustain him at bay. Hunter's relentless assaults started to reverse the situation. The man he had initially tackled was. The second assailant is now kneeling, holding his wounded arm, and slowly slipping away into the shadows. As he watched the dog overwhelm his partner, he paused, horrified. "You're going to regret this," the third man growled. As he confronted Hunter, his knife shook a little in his hand, but before he could move, Hunter attacked once more. The ranger used the man's fear when his jaws snapped dangerously near his leg, causing him to drop the weapon. The attention, giving the man he was battling a powerful blow that sent him falling on the woodland floor. The ranger, panting, turned to face Clara and yelled, "Are you okay?" Clara nodded, tears running down her cheeks as she held the infant, and his voice was tinged with worry. "We're okay," she said. With two of the attackers already fleeing into the woods, and the third one rendered incapable, she was able to speak in a tremulous voice. Hunter stood straight, his chest heaving as the immediate threat appeared to have subsided. His muscles and fur were matted with dirt as he watched the last menace vanish into the night. Shook from the exertion, but his steadfast will kept them going. The ranger went to. "You saved us," Hunter whispered, resting a gentle hand on the dog's shoulder. Hunter's eyes briefly met Clara's before he let out a low whine in an expression of appreciation and admiration. Returning to the forest, his ears remained attentive and pricked up despite his victory. He stayed alert, prepared to protect his new family from any additional. Clara held the infant tight as the forest descended into a tense calm, her pulse pounding from the threats. Find the ranger kneeling next to Hunter, examining the dog's injuries, but, "You're one tough dog," the ranger said, adding that they were a monument to the struggle he had fought to safeguard them. Hunter was given a gentle pat, but the victory was short-lived since a new sound came from the shadows, beginning with weak branches. A terrible howl reverberated through the trees, the sound of snapping leaves crunching getting louder by the second. The ranger grimly whispered, "Wolves," as Clara's eyes widened and her breath caught in her throat. Hunter's ears perked up at their close companion's quiet, frantic voice, and he let. His stiff, exhausted body was suddenly forgotten when he let out a low, warning growl. The ranger pulled out his flashlight and moved in front of Clara and the infant, its illumination sweeping across the yellow treetops. Wolves' eyes flashed in the distance. They were already circling, so we had to move. Despite the mounting strain, the ranger encouraged his voice to remain steady, but moving wasn't in choice. Clara was paralyzed by terror as the infant shifted uneasily in her arms. Hunter took a firm position between them and the advancing pack. The wolves resolutely emerged from the shadows, sleek shapes, their predatory grace, and their greater leader. The others gritted their teeth and growled softly, indicating their intention to. The ranger grabbed a solid wood and wielded it as a makeshift weapon, telling Clara to keep behind him. Hunter, seeing that the odds were against them, charged toward the wolves without waiting for them to attack. The wolves were caught off guard as the leader's strong jaws snapped, but they swiftly regrouped. Hunter's focus was unwavering as he pounced at one wolf, closing down on him despite their instincts urging them to surround him. Causing it to back off with a yelp, another wolf lunged at Hunter's side, its jaws brushing his flank, but he turned abruptly and struck the pack hard in return. I paused, apprehensive of the dog's viciousness. Hunter's howl sent a primordial warning that he would. The pack leader advanced, its enormous body looming over him, fighting to the death to protect those behind him. Hunter. The wolf's jaws swung out as the two locked eyes in a quiet struggle of wills. Hunter's neck was just inches away from breaking, but he quickly sidestepped and used his momentum to knock the wolf off balance. A flurry of fury and fangs characterized the clash, but Hunter's unwavering determination won him the advantage with a strong blow that knocked the leader flying to the ground, causing the other wolves to falter and lose confidence without. At the order of their leader, they growled and circled, but they remained at a distance, seeing Hunter standing erect and bloodied yet. His growls were an unwavering vow that he would not back down, and the ranger seized. As he shouted to the pack to move farther back and to go, he waved the branch violently. Shouted, his voice gradually reverberating through the forest as the wolves withdrew, sliding back into the shadows one by one. Hunter remained motionless, his chest heaving, watching the wolves vanish as the adrenaline started to fading as his body shook from fatigue. Clara hurried nearer and knelt down beside him. Hunter, you saved us again, she said in a heartfelt murmur. We need to get him to safety. He's hurt, but he's a warrior. The ranger put a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. Hunter sipped a gentle glass of wine while leaning his head against Clara's arm. Despite his wounds, he had a silent sense of pride in his eyes, which was a mirror of the relationship he had developed with this frail group. The infant shifted in Clara's embrace, its small hand grazing Hunter's. As though to express gratitude, the group crowded against the cabin, which was now only a. Hunter hobbled a short distance away, but remained vigilant, keeping his senses tuned to any. When they eventually arrived at the modest building, the walls, however decrepit, were a relief of the remaining hazards, and whether to offer a haven, a place where Clara could finally relax. As the ranger attended to Hunter's injuries, the infant was placed gently on a stack of blankets. You're amazing, the ranger remarked. I've never seen a dog with such bravery as Hunter, gently wiping a wound on his side. For the first time since the journey started, Hunter closed his eyes and relaxed. Clara sat next to him and held his hand. As dawn broke over the forest, she said to her family, "You're not just a hero, Hunter," as she rested softly on his fur. Clara awoke to the soft sound of birdsong and the golden light that came through the crevices in the cabin's wooden walls. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she felt calm as she looked over at Hunter lying and heard the baby's gentle sing. Despite the fatigue carved into his body, there was a steady rise and fall in the baby's chest. Tranquility about him, a silent triumph in his amber eyes. The ranger brought a little first aid bag into the cabin and a new blanket. He inquired, referring to Hunter. "Clara, how's our hero?" Clara grinned. Hunter woke up a little at the sight of him, still standing and a little exhausted. His ears perked up as he looked from one to the other, and the ranger crouched next to him, closely examining the. "You deserve your rest, big guy," he whispered, rubbing behind Hunter's ear with the bandages he had put on the previous evening. The baby gurgled quietly as Clara held it, its small hand reaching out, pulled the youngster closer to Hunter, allowing it to touch the dog's fur. "Without you, we wouldn't be here." Hunter gave a quiet huff in response, his tail wagging slightly against her voice as she spoke, her voice breaking with sorrow. The floor by mid-morning, when distant car sounds pierced the silence of the woodland, Sarah's heart began to race. The ranger went outside and waved as she heard voices yelling for help and rescue. Someone's tone was frantic. They arrived in a bustle of activity, their radios crackling and heading toward the group of rescuers approaching the cottage. One of the medics hurried to Clara, boots crunching on the earth, to make sure she and the infant were safe. Clara clutched on to the baby firmly while tears streamed down her face, and we reassured her that we would take care of you both. "Okay, because of him," she said, gesturing to Hunter. The rescuers' faces shifted to the dog. One asked B, who was stooping to examine Hunter, shifting to awe. "This dog protected you out here?" The ranger nodded, narrating the terrifying run-ins with the wolves and the trek through the forest as the medics got ready to take Clara and the infant hesitated as she glanced down at Hunter, wondering why he hadn't come. She added firmly, "Don't worry, he's coming with us." One of the rescuers grinned. "A dog like this deserves a..." Hunter's story swiftly gained traction in news sites, and social media lighted up as the hero returned to the safety of civilization. Donations flooded in for the story of the peaceful savage stray who had put everything on the line to save a defenseless infant. People from all over the world showed their appreciation and thanks for the veterinary care Hunter got. Despite the wounds from his previous life and the recent struggles, his spirit persisted despite the treatment he required. Unbroken Clara came to see him every day, and the baby always admired their relationship. Got more powerful every second, and a week later, Clara was standing outside the clinic, tensely fidgeting with her. Hunter's wounds were healed, and he trotted out with his tail wagging excitedly as the doors opened. And Clara knelt, throwing her arms, and his formerly tired eyes shone with vitality. She murmured, "Month Pet and Hunter, you're coming home with us." Around him, gotten used to his new life with Clara and the baby, and the days of mindlessly exploring the wilderness were over. Hunger and survival. But now that he had a family, his once guarded heart had a purpose. Clara frequently watched in wonder as Hunter and the infant played, softened and full of the warmth of love and belonging. Hunter would gently push toys toward the youngster or let small hands tug on his ears as they both giggled. Clara would tell him, "You're more than just a protector." One lovely afternoon, she sat on the porch with her family. Hunter was lying close by, enjoying the warmth as she reached over and held the baby in her lap. "You saved us in every way," she whispered quietly, stroking her hand over his fur. Hunter's story became a symbol of understanding as he turned his head and met her gaze. The town honored him as a local hero for his tenacity and devotion, even hosting a small celebration in his honor. However, he was much more than that to Clara and the infant. He was their companion, their guardian, and a continual reminder of the strength of love, and their relationship only grew stronger over time. Hunter grew older with grace, his once strong body slowing down yet maintaining its vigor on calm nights. He and Clara would sit and talk about their amazing journey, and after the infant, who was now a toddler, went to sleep, Clara would smile as she cuddled up to Hunter, knowing that they were meant to be together. A family. Please remember to like, share, and comment if this story resonated with you. For more amazing stories of tenacity, love, and loyalty, please subscribe to our channel. As always, thank you. You participating in our narrative.